It's not until we understand where we come from that we can connect the humanity piece for me. I think that when I can connect my history and realize where I come from and how far I've come is when I can connect humanly to who I am. Once I know who I am, that helps me to understand what I'm called to do. It's very important to the college community, to us as faculty or staff or students, definitely our students, for them to be able to connect, who they are as humans so that they can understand their calling and understand their vocation. Because it's not until I connect with me and find out who I am that I can determine what my calling is and what my vocation is. So this being able to see my history definitely helps me to understand what I'm called to do and what my vocation is.
I feel like a trip like this, where you learn about people like Bryan Stevenson, you learn about all these people all throughout history who have given of themselves, sacrificed in order to give to something higher than themselves. I feel like that in my doing that, going back home and working in that specific area, that's one way that I can give back of myself to help a cause that's bigger than I am.
Where I grew up, I didn't really have people that looked like me who were educators or in higher positions other than me, and I always thought that it would be nice for me to have something like that. So I'm hoping that through learning about our history, I can be someone who can go back home and maybe teach other African Americans or all of the U.S. in general about our history and what we can do to fix that, because I think that history is valuable and that I'm really sad I've been robbed of it for a very long time or taught wrong information. So I hope that my calling can be just going back home and teaching more people about it, and to promote conversations and dialogues, and to share people's stories about discrimination they faced, and hopefully through that there can be a huge enlightenment and then we can progress.
The museum and a memorial for peace and justice was established by the Equal Justice Initiative, and that was begun by Bryan Stevenson, a lawyer, and I think 1980. It's been about 30 years.
This museum is most obviously the product of Bryan Stevenson's advocacy on race and racism issues. When you go to the museum, you hear his voice throughout all of the exhibits, and you see very clearly the main thrust of his advocacy work, which is that slavery was the product of an ideology of white superiority, and that when slavery was forcibly ended in 1865, that ideology, that vicious, pernicious ideology, just changed the way that it oppressed black people in America. So that during Reconstruction, you see this brief period in which civil rights and equality is protected by the federal government. But after the end of Reconstruction, you see throughout this museum all of the different ways that white superiority continued to manifest itself in really vicious attacks on and suppression of African Americans in America. The museum itself is built on the site of a slave warehouse. As you enter it, the first room is a dark room with, I think, 3 or 4 informational videos running in loops. And you wouldn't think that videos could be as powerful as this, but one of them shows the expansion of the domestic slave trade throughout America after the international trade was ended.
And we could see those, what I consider as the silhouettes of, there was various ones. There was a lady that was singing, and I think that the Negro spirituals that she was singing was about the troubles that she had experienced. So the pain that she was experiencing come out through her music. But there was another one, there was 2 children And the two children were asking, and it was almost like it was, even though it was a silhouette, but it seemed real to me as I was standing there when the little boy said, "Have you seen my mommy?" And we don't know where our mommy is.
It really works to build a timeline. And on the wall, as you're looking at this room, you see the different stages of the legacy of slavery in America. This is why it's called the Legacy Museum, is that the museum is about slavery, but its legacy through the different stages of American racism. And it ties a line from slavery to Jim Crow and lynching. And a lot of the museum is about lynching. And it carries that forward into the modern era and mass incarceration.
Is to understand that the effect of racism and slavery relates to individual people and families. It's easy for me and for other people that I talk to think about those people who were affected by slavery, the people who are African American or the blacks who bear the brunt of the effect of those experiences. And we think of them, I do, in a collective way as them. The pictures and the narratives and then the names of all the victims of lynching in the memorial bring home really clearly that these acts were done not to a collective whole, but they were done to individuals. And many times they were done for very particular individual reasons. And making that step from thinking about racism as a problem of a group related to another group, and seeing it more as the effect of some group understanding on particular individuals really comes home through the experience of the museums.
Dehumanizing people is a way for people to do such grotesque things to humans. I feel as though people have a moral conscience, but in order for them to fight off that natural instinct, they have to dehumanize something, which is something I never heard of or thought of. But being in the museum and seeing how the African Americans were treated and how they are still being treated horribly, and how that skews from like not treating them with the same human rights as other people should be entitled to, was very shocking.
I'm African American, and my culture wasn't really talked about a lot with my father. He kind of tried to deny the fact that we were African American. I went on this trip to learn more about the people, where I come from, and some stuff that my family members, even if I don't know who they are, have been through. They deserve to know that someone from their lineage who doesn't know who they are still cares what they've been through.
One thing that was most moving for me on this trip was probably the instance of going to the Legacy Museum, and also learning more about the Equal Justice Initiative that individuals like Bryan Stevenson have founded to help people who are victimized by the broken elements of our criminal justice system. That was particularly moving to me because my goal is to use a law degree in the future to help people who are underrepresented, who are marginalized, who are in need of the best services that we can provide across the board, not just in terms of representing them in a court of law, but really just that motif of standing up for people who are marginalized, who are oppressed, who don't have anybody else to stand up for them. That was particularly moving to me, learning more about the Equal Justice Initiative and about this whole movement to represent whole communities, whole groups of people who have been oppressed for such a long time and are even oppressed still to this day. That was very important to me.
The most poignant kind of experience that I was able to experience on this trip was the lynching memorial. I think it's so hard to look, and especially when you're at the bottom of the memorial and you just see all of the monuments with, names covering them of people that were just senselessly killed. it's just so hard to deny, and then to realize how recent all of it was. I mean, we look at stuff like the Holocaust and we think, oh my gosh, that's awful, those people didn't do anything. We did the same exact thing, and we minimize it, and we don't talk about it as much as we talk about World War II or who knows what else, other atrocities that have occurred in history that other countries committed, because it's easier to talk about other people's wrongdoings. It's a lot harder to admit we did something terrible, and these are the awful, awful mistakes that we've made, and this is how we need to change things. I mean, there were people at the memorial who were looking for family members and found family members' names on the monuments. That's really recent. This stuff happened within people's lifetimes.
One of the biggest and most stark aspects of the trip was the steps that it seems we've taken as a country to continuously oppress people, and not just one group of people, more so many groups of people. And whether it started with slavery or with the war on drugs, it's all interconnected in a big web, and that was just startling. What surprised me the most was to see that this is a modern issue. It's not just a past issue from centuries ago, but that it's not just their fight, it's our fight. And it's the world's fight, because it's not just America. It's everywhere, all over the world, and that we all have to do something in order to fix the problem. One of the museums had an interactive guide on how to fix things, and it was the biggest headline said voter registration, and finding the right candidate to put in office that is willing to get into this fight head first, but as a person, it is vying for that candidate and being out there and saying, this is why you should vote for them, and just doing your civic duty to vote.
So on the second day we did Birmingham. We did the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, and on Sunday we went to church at 16th Street Baptist, which is the church that was bombed in 1963, where 4 little girls were killed during the height of the civil rights movement.
I consider this Black history, and Black history is not taught. And I think it's very good for our students to see those things, because I am somewhat removed from that era, but they're very far removed from that era. And I think the world that they live in, it's probably hard for them to even comprehend. We need to reconnect them to the history so that they understand why they are standing where they're standing. We're standing on other people's shoulders, people that went before us. And so they'll never experience what those kids experienced simply because of what those kids actually experienced. And so time has moved on, but we can't forget our history. And I think that because they're so far removed from it, I think that this generation, in a sense, has forgotten the history, or is not reminded enough of the history so that they can see just how far we've come. So I think that on either side, whether it's African American students, Caucasian students, Hispanic students, I think that history is very important to this generation, for them to be able to pull pieces together to understand just what their history is really, what all it entails.
Ending the trip in that way on something very relational, on with a chance to talk and interact and eat with people whose life was still lived in this important civil rights site, whose faith was still deeply tied to civil rights, not just because of who they were, but because of this building and this city that they worshiped in, was something that was immensely powerful as a way to wrap up the field trip.
One of the phrases that John Hinkle used in our trip this time that I thought was really accurate was that an explanation and an experience are completely different things. An explanation is what we do in a classroom. It's what we do when we provide a text for a student to read, and they can understand through our explanation of what happened at a certain time or what a text means. But it is a completely different thing when the student themselves and myself, when you experience the place, it transcends all the explanations that anybody else can provide, and it provides this really thick dimension of not only what you see and hear, but you feel and you relate spatially and physically. And that experience can become a pivotal kind of moment for understanding what people have gone through, what our community means in ways that you can never get through simply by providing an explanation.
After this trip was over, we all got together and we decided to have a group reflection. And during that reflection, there were so many people who have had experiences that I could never imagine just looking at them. You get to know them on a deeper level, and you get to know how much racism and everything that African Americans and people of all races have been through, including myself.
I would absolutely recommend this trip to everybody. It is not expensive at all, but it is well worth the experience that you get, not just learning about yourself, learning about history, learning about civics, but also the experiences with your friends. It was so much fun just to be around them and being able to share this learning opportunity with them. I think I came in to Georgetown seeing it as a Christian-basis school that's not going to budge on any beliefs, that is just going to stay where it pleases. But after this trip and getting to know like the faculty that was there and seeing how these kinds of things relate to their life and how they've gone out into the world to say what is right, what isn't, whether or not their spouse believes it, I think it kind of shows that at Georgetown, you are allowed to be your own person, but at the same time, you don't have to be the odd duck out. You can be yourself within your group.
One reason why I think it's particularly important for students to go on this trip is that, especially in my position being, this my first semester of college, it's really a formative time where you learn more than you ever have before in your life. And I think that going on a trip like this, where you learn about the really terrible details of slavery, of mass incarceration, of racial terror, of just so many instances of terrible injustices that so many people have been forced to suffer. I think that learning about that in the way that we do on this trip, through the Legacy Museum, through the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, I think that it allows you to learn in a more intimate way about this subject material than you ever would just reading it from a textbook, than just watching a documentary about it. It kind of puts you face to face with the injustices behind these acts. And with that knowledge, you can come back and go throughout the rest of your college career into your second semester, freshman year, sophomore, junior, senior, and on past your undergraduate years, to really internalize what you learned on a trip like this and have it in the back of your mind the whole step of the way. What can I do? What's the next step I can take in my academic career to make sure that nothing like that ever happens again? What's something I can do to help ameliorate the lasting negative impacts of these terrible instances of injustice?
I also think that I'm really grateful to be attending an institution that is willing to give me these opportunities to go out and to gain more knowledge, not just in a classroom setting, but to get amongst it and to really immerse myself in these situations and in these locations, in these areas where I can really see the effects of our history and I mean, things that are still happening to educate me in ways that a classroom experience never really could do the same way.
Even in all the pain and all of the suffering that happened or that was exhibited in the museums, I could still come out and rejoice and celebrate, and most of all be thankful, because those that endured to me the pain and the suffering made it so much easier for me today. I experience maybe pain, hurt, maybe more so of hurtful feelings, but the pain that they endured, I don't think I'll experience that in my lifetime. And I won't experience that in my lifetime because of what they did before. So even though there's a lot of pain and hurt in there in those museums, the celebration, the rejoicing, and being so thankful for where I am today because of them just brings me joy.
We realize that our Foundations and Core program is hopefully training students to be able to read complicated texts, to see the significance of context, the need for accurate interpretation, and then ways of engaging in the ideas and the stories that we're exposing them to in this course.
This was the first time that we'd been able to do any kind of field trip in Foundations 111, and it was something that I've been really excited about the prospect of for a couple of years. Since Roger got this grant for working on vocation across the academy, we've thought about Foundations 111 as an important place to try and get people thinking about vocation, and it was the most obvious thing because it's a class that every freshman takes, and because of that, we could really use it for working on something that was supposed to have reach across the curriculum. Past that, Foundations 111 since the beginning was always supposed to be the driver of an intellectual conversation on campus, and that's something that we always struggled to get right. It's one thing to have conversations inside your classrooms with students about issues like politics, religion, philosophy, things that are really important to the experience of being a human being, and are really important to a liberal arts education. But it's another thing entirely to get them to connect these issues to their life and the issues that they take seriously right now.
Through those experiences, we provided our students an experience or a time where they could begin to put together their understanding of the context of their own history as Americans, and their understanding of the effect of racial injustice and practices from 200 years ago until current situations now with incarceration. And that step forward into being able to demonstrate how these historical events have a direct bearing on how they read and understand our society today. I think it's just a profound expression of the good of what both the Foundations and Core program is seeking, and what we as a liberal arts college are seeking to enable our students to be able to do.